I think we're ready.
Cool. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this session. We're going to be discussing what we mean by decolonizing economics. And I think that this is a very timely and meaningful discussion that is going to be had because of the context that we find ourselves in during COVID-19 and the Black Lives Matter protests that we've just witnessed. We were asking ourselves what a reimagined society looks like and what a reimagined economy looks like and what reimagining economic development looks like. So my name is Tsegofatso Kutu. I'm a master's student at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. I'm studying my master's in economic development, and my research is centered on development financing and its implication on development policy in Africa. I also have done some work on post-coloniality, so post-colony and development and African nationalism, because I have my undergraduate background in politics, philosophy, and economics. So today we're going to be joined by three really incredible speakers who have done a lot of work in their respective continents on decolonization and making economics work for the global South context. And their bios are in the program, so I'm not going to outline everything, but I will present them. So we're going to have Dr. Grieve Chelwa, who is a senior lecturer at the University of Cape Town's Graduate Business School. He has been a postdoctoral fellow at the Harvard Center for African Studies, and also has been a fellow at the University of Witwatersrand's Institute for Social and Economic Research. Then we're going to have Dr. Cecilia Lanata Briones, who is a teaching fellow at the University of Warwick. She is a member of Diversifying and Decolonising Economics and has a research background in the institutions and public statistics in Argentina and Latin America. Lastly, but not least, we have Dr. Jayati Ghosh, who's a professor of economics at Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi, India. She's an executive secretary of the International Development Economics Associates and has a research in globalization, gender, poverty, and inequality. I'm also going to introduce our technical assistant for the session, who is Bandile Ngidi from the Institute of Economic Justice in South Africa. He also plays a very important organizing role in Rethinking Economics for Africa, based in South Africa. So I'm just going to go over the format of the discussion and then also outline some rules for engagement, and then we can begin our discussion. In terms of the format, every speaker is going to have 10 to 15 minutes to present some of their thoughts on what decolonizing economics looks like. And then we'll allow the speakers to engage with what they have said and pose some questions to each other, and then we will open up the floor for questions to the public, questions and comments to the public. In terms of the rules, because this is a webinar, you will not be able to unmute yourself or to turn on your video, but you can put your questions and comments in the chat, which I will be monitoring. And I'll draw from your questions to pose to the speakers and facilitate the engagement. Cool. With all of that being said, I would like to ask Dr. Grieve Chelwa to open up the floor and the discussion for us.
Okay, good afternoon from Cape Town. I know people are in different time zones. So good afternoon from Cape Town. We're experiencing winter in the Southern Hemisphere. So, I mean, I don't have a jacket on, but I'm trying to sort of speak to our friends in the North. So good afternoon from Cape Town. It really is a unique honor for me to be invited to speak on this very important topic at this very important festival that I've followed over the years and I have a lot of respect for. It's also a unique honor to speak alongside two colleagues that I have the utmost respect for, whose work I have followed and read in my life. So it's a unique honor. Thanks for asking me to be a part of this. So I mean, the topic really of this particular plenary is sort of to disentangle this concept of decolonization insofar as economics is concerned. Really, what does decolonization mean in the context of economics? Right, let me just minimize here. So what does decolonization mean in the context of economics? Now, rather than attempt at defining what decolonization means in the context of economics, which is sort of a very difficult thing to do, what I thought I would rather do is ask the following easier question, right? Which is economics colonized? So I'm thinking this is a much easier question to ask and to attempt answering rather than the much more difficult one, which is what do we mean by decolonizing economics? And my hope is that as I try to sort of answer this question of is economics colonized, it might be implied in there what we are trying to drive at when we talk about decolonizing economics. So I think it is pointless to ask the question that I want to ask, which is economics colonized? It's pointless to ask it in the abstract. What I want to do is to make this question much more concrete by asking, is economics, as it is practiced today in the global South, a colonized terrain? So is economics, as it is practiced today in the global South, a colonized terrain? And to be even more specific, I want to sort of ask this question based on where I am right now, where I'm sort of giving this webinar from in Africa. Is a practice of economics colonial in its manifestations here in Africa? Right, so this is really the question that I'm going to ask in the next couple of minutes that I've been assigned to talk. I shall attempt to answer this question by looking at three ways through which the discipline of economics furthers its agenda or carries out its business. So I shall attempt to answer this question that I'm going to pose: is economics colonized in Africa? Is economics a colonized terrain in Africa? I shall attempt to answer this question by looking at three ways through which the discipline of economics sort of perpetuates itself, through which it manifests itself or carries out its business. I'll look at classroom instruction. So what's the nature of classroom instruction in African universities? I'll look at the conduct of research. So how is economics research conducted in Africa, as well as the last bit, which is how is policy work conducted in Africa, right? Because by the way, it is worth mentioning that there are very few disciplines in the social sciences that easily automatically lend themselves to policy the way economics does, right? Especially here in Africa, where the imperative for development appears to be most urgent. So much of the research that is conducted here in Africa is likely, and that much of the research that is likely to be funded is always of the policy relevant type. So if colleagues on the African continent who might be joining on this webinar, if they've, for example, participated in calls for proposals, calls for research proposals, and so on and so forth, it is always sort of couched in the policy relevance, type. This research needs to be relevant for policy. Which is a pity, which in itself needs to be, that idea needs to be decolonized, because our friends in the North have the luxury of blue sky research in terms of economics. They can waste time writing mathematical models or asking all sorts of questions that do not necessarily directly lend themselves to policy, right? So I think, one of the things I have here is to say I yearn for a time, for example, when an African researcher researching economics can ask a following question: what, if any, are the economic lessons contained in Fela Kuti's music? The big Nigerian Afrobeat legend, right? If you listen to his music, there's always some, economic tits and bits there. So it would be nice for someone to write a paper about that, to research particular Fela Kuti's music insofar as economic development is concerned. But anyway, so this is really how I'm going to structure my presentation. Try to answer the question, is economics in Africa a colonized terrain, by looking at what happens in the classroom, what happens in the research sphere, and also what happens in terms of policy, right? So let's start at the classroom, the beginning, the classroom. So has economics colonized the classroom in the African case? And here, my answer is an unequivocal yes, right? So my answer is an unequivocal yes. I myself, having gotten my undergraduate in an African university, gotten my PhD in an African university. So for me, the answer here is an unequivocal yes. So how is it colonized in the classroom? Here, the curriculum is littered with the writings of many dead white men who conceptualized many of the ideas largely in the furtherance of empire. So if you study economics at the first year level, the second year level, in most of our African universities, you're most likely to 100% chance that you encounter Adam Smith, you're going to encounter David Ricardo, you're going to encounter John Stuart Mill, and so on and so forth, right? So the curriculum is really littered with the writings of dead white men, all the way through Paul Samuelson, who wrote his famous textbook, right? So the curriculum is littered with the writings of many dead white men. Courses on economic development that tend to be very popular in the African universities precisely because of this urgency of development. Those courses naturally take the rise of the West or the global North as points of departure, and they rarely, if ever, introduce students to such hypotheses as, did slavery and the slave trade aid the rise of the West? Has neocolonialism, so neocolonialism, this concept that was developed by Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah, has neocolonialism thwarted the development prospects of Africa? So if you've taken a course in the economics department in many African universities, you are rarely, if ever, exposed to these hypotheses that the rise of the West might have been aided by slavery, by slave trade, and the fact that Africa's development prospects or have gotten dire, or Africa's development prospects have been thwarted precisely by what Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah referred to as neocolonialism. So we're hardly exposed to these kinds of things, right? So relatedly to this, the West is taught uncritically in Africa, in African universities, right? So the West is taught very uncritically to us. All the policy successes, for example, the taming of inflation, happen in the West with swashbuckling heroes, always men, always almost white men like Paul Volcker, who used to be the chair of the US Fed in the late 70s and early 80s. So all the policy successes happen in the West, we are told, and we know and critically, and all the policy mistakes happen in Africa, right? So which then has implications for who can initiate good policy change. So something I'll come back to in terms of policy, right? So really, in terms of classroom instructions, students who learn economics on the African continent are largely prepared for survival in postgraduate programs in the West. So we're prepared to survive in postgraduate programs in the West, or to take up positions in such places as the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, international NGOs, and multinational corporations, MNCs. So this is a situation that's highly reminiscent of the very basic training that a small cadre of natives received in preparing them to administer, at least cost, the colonial empire. So this is precisely how classroom instruction operates in sort of African universities. Let me go to the second aspect of my question, as you remember, about is economics in Africa a colonized terrain, by looking at precisely how research is conducted in the African context. Here, is economics research colonized in Africa? Again, for me, it's an unequivocal yes. How? So to be able to answer this question about research, I'll look at the three parts of the research process: the conceptualization of the problem, the research process itself, and the process by which results are published, right? So let's look at the conceptualization of the problem. So as I alluded to earlier, much research work in Africa is very policy driven. And here the research problems are always couched as follows. This is always how the research problem is couched in the African sense when you're trying to do research on Africa, whether you be an African or somebody from the outside. Why does Africa have poor outcomes in X, right? With the implication that those outcomes are much better in the West, right? So why does Africa have poor outcomes in X, whereas we in the West have better outcomes in this thing? So the West really as archetype. Also, the assumption, hardly ever critiqued, is that Africa's problems originate from internal issues, something that I've alluded to before, what the late, great Thandika Mkandawire called the internalist perspective. So always the research problems are couched in the way that suggests or assumes that Africa's problems are really the problems of its own creation. And really what we as researchers should do is try to understand why that is the case, right? So this is almost always how all research research projects are conceptualized. Even African researchers themselves, in their ill-fated attempt to publish in the West, right? If you're on the African continent like me, you know that you face incredibly slim odds of publication success in top Western journals. So even African researchers themselves, in their ill-fated attempt to publish in the West, tend to frame the problem in the way that I've just described. What the Beninese philosopher Pauline Hatunji has called extraversion, right? So in our attempt to get publication success in the West, we have to play this game where we always assume, where the presumption, the premise is that Africa's problems are internal, they're internally caused. Therefore, we have to also ask research questions that really speak to this presumption or assumption, right? Let's look at the research process itself. So there's the conceptualization of the problem, then the research process. Here in the research process, we largely see a research division of labor, whereby Africans are largely the hewers of wood and the drawers of water, and the Western principal investigators, almost always white men, almost always white men, not always, but almost always white men, and increasingly now white women, are the plantation lords or madams, right? The research problem is conceptualized in the West with a Western PI who employs an army of natives to implement the research project. So many of the on the ground natives are highly educated locals. Some of them, people like me, people like my professors at the University of Zambia. Some of them even have PhDs with many years of experience, but they're mostly relegated to the task of data collection, right? So the natives are mostly, tend to be relatively well educated by African standards, but then they're relegated to this task of data collection. Some of the PIs, the plantation lords and madams, are young graduate students at universities in the West, right? So the native data collector or the native informant is rewarded materially, right, financially, but also otherwise via an honorable mention in some buried footnote on the front page of the Quarterly Journal of Economics, right? Also, it's worth mentioning here the role played by research participants, the poor. Remember that the problems of Africa are all about poverty in economics. So also worth mentioning that the role played by the participants, the poor, who are viewed not as subjects or co-producers of knowledge, but as objects from whom to extract the intellectual surplus that later top journals in the field, right? A great many of the research projects in Africa unfold in this way. I mean, this is very much typified, for example, by the case of Busia in Western Kenya, which is really the epicenter of the RCTs, if you might call it an epidemic. The RCT's capital of the world, which is sort of Busia, Western Kenya, where you see a lot of this, what I've just described, being played out there. So let's go to the last bit of the publication process. So once the intellectual surplus has been extracted, it has to be processed and then packaged for showcasing in the top journals. Production processes always have to have quality controllers. So in our case, there's research in Africa, the role of quality controllers is left to northern gatekeepers who are presumed to know what does and doesn't constitute knowledge about the continent. So here, in essence, the global north is in conversation with itself about Africa. The Africans here are just spectators, not unlike their foremothers and fathers in the colonial times, right? So this is also what largely explains this thing that Pauline Hatunji calls extraversion, right? We know that the global north gatekeepers are conversing with themselves and they have the presumptions about what ails Africa. So if we are to have any publication success, we have to pretend to be participants in that conversation by framing research problems in the way that would be acceptable to them. So the research process that I've detailed here repeats itself via vicious cycles and is aided and abated by self-referential citation rings, research funding, and so on and so forth. I want to quickly, I might be running out of time, so I want to quickly go to the last part, which looks at policy. So is economics policy making in Africa colonized? Again, here, I'm sad to report the answer is yes. So at any point in time, the policy-making terrain in Africa is dominated by an army, right? A conquering army of northern policy experts who are highly subsidized by the aid industry. In 2010, the late great Malawian economist Stanley Kamkandawire estimated that there were over 100,000 foreign experts at any point in Africa, costing well over $4 billion per annum, which is direct financial cost, but we can imagine this cost is much bigger if we add the policy mistakes, the costs of policy mistakes, right? Again, the division of labor here is such that the foreign experts diagnose the problems, formulate the solutions, that is, do all the thinking, while the natives are responsible for the unquestioning implementation of the solutions. Like the missionaries and colonial governors of yore, these experts are engaged in the mission civilisatrice, and civilizing mission. They know what's good for Africa, and they're here to spread the good word, right? It's important to note that the policy and research sphere interact and feed off each other in self-reinforcing ways. For example, the randomista revolution that has swept much of the development research work in Africa has set up regional policy hubs that are meant to quickly convert research findings into implementable policy solutions. So really, in essence, what I've just described now here, very quickly, the foregoing clearly demonstrates that Northern economics and Northern economists have established what Sabelo Ndlovu Gacheni calls a cognitive empire over the African continent, right? So Northern economics and Northern economists have established this cognitive empire over the African continent. And without, a cop out on my part, without having to define what decolonization means for economics, I think for me, the task of decolonization is really to decenter Northern economics and Northern economists in the processes that I've just articulated above, before. And like the battles for political decolonization, which we sort of, that happened in the run up to the 1960s after World War II, like the battles for political decolonization, decentering Northern economists or Northern economics won't be easy, precisely because no one ever gives up empire easily or voluntarily. It is also important to be on the lookout of the possibility that the process of decolonization itself, the process of decolonizing economics, if we accept that it's something that's worth doing, and I think it is, we also have to be on the lookout that that process of decolonization is itself not colonized, right? So really, this is what I had to share with colleagues today, and I will be happy to answer any questions. Yeah, so that's it from my side. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Can we please move on to our next speaker, Cecilia?
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I would just like to start by thanking Rethinking for the invitation, and for all of you that are, either participating like me or joining as attendees in this session and in the festival more broadly. This is an amazingly interesting panel, and it's a pleasure to be part of it. So I wanted to kind of, before I start, do two kind of disclosure comments. So I wanted to talk to you about the topic of the panel, or letting you know to begin with that this is a reflection from experience and from practice. It is in no way, shape, or form a theoretical approach to decolonizing economics. And in that aim to try to talk to you from experience, then I want to tell you a little bit of where I'm coming from. First of all, I don't define myself as an economist anymore. I'm an economic historian. If you were to ask me how would I think of myself and how I would define myself, and to be honest, I never thought of myself as purely an economist. Basically, because when I was doing my undergraduate degree in economics at the University of Buenos Aires in Argentina, I was also doing an undergraduate degree in sociology. And after that, my education continued here in the UK with an MSc and a PhD in economic history. So what I want to disclose and to be very honest to you from the very start is that from the beginning of my career and my formation as an academic, I've strongly believed that economics is a social science that goes well beyond the analysis of the optimal allocation of scarce resources, because it deals with individuals, it deals with humans, even if we think sometimes of them as a collective, and because economics is intertwined at the very least with society, politics, and history. So, what do I think about when I think about decolonizing economics? Well, this is a very, as we have said, it's a very, very difficult question. And again, I don't think I'm going to be able to really answer it, but I'm going to give you some pointers from my experiences as a student and as a lecturer, both in the global south, or mainly in Argentina, and since I've been here in the UK for several years now, actually. After I talk a little bit about that, I will highlight what these perspectives from these different parts of the world have in common and how they differ, and then I will finish my intervention by talking about what I think we can do to decolonize economics. So from the perspective of the global South, and as I mentioned to you before, I'm going to be talking about my undergraduate student experience and my experience as a very early researcher. Right after I finished my undergraduate degree in Buenos Aires, the core of what gets taught is, again, in Argentina, no? Mainstream macro and microeconomics using your usual suspect textbooks that are translated into, in my case, Spanish. So for example, I studied macro and taught macro at the University of Buenos Aires with Blanchard textbook. However, many courses added material from local or regional, many times heterodox economists, particularly when studying development and or history. And here regional, I mean Latin American. I generally had the choice to pick who I took my macro courses or my micro courses with. So unlike what happens here in the UK, for example, there were two, let's say macro 2 courses headed by 2 different module leaders, and you were able to choose, right? If you wanted to do it with module leader A or with module leader B, and this implied that you could choose a more mainstream or a more pluralist approach to either macro or micro, right? I also had compulsory economic history and history of economic taught modules, as well as development economics. And I could only take, when I was doing my undergrad, 2 optional modules. So mainly it was a degree full of compulsory courses. What I was taught or what I was examined on relied exclusively on what was translated into Spanish, which means that it was very hard to come across, for example, the latest papers and the latest research. This was due to a language barrier. The University of Buenos Aires is a state-funded public university, so they couldn't assume that everyone knew English. And it was also, to a lesser extent, what I was taught and examined on depended on what lecturers could get their hands upon, due to the high cost and journal databases and books. Many lecturers mentioned the latest papers more along the lines of anecdotal research rather than that material that was relevant for the course. This also meant, for example, that what was written about Argentine history or Argentine development and published in English-speaking journals by economists of any theoretical inclination and nationality was harder to come by. I was luckily, or had the luck to be hired as a research assistant within a heterodox economics research institute called CIEP, or Centro Interdisciplinario para el Estudio de Políticas Públicas, and got to work with a group of economists that, like me, tried to look at the role of society, politics, history, and gender when doing economic analysis. That opened a door to literature that I didn't get taught at university, and which was mainly not in Spanish. I in my undergrad a very long time ago, in the early 2000s, and at that time, most of my lecturers were men, and so were most of my colleagues in academia. From the perspective of the global north, and here I'm drawing on my experience as a lecturer in the UK, course module or course content is comprised mainly of material closely linked to mainstream economics. There are some newish textbooks out there that incorporate more heterodox content, like Carlin and Soskes and macroeconomics, or obviously the core textbook, the core team textbook. But obviously all content is in English, and content from the global south is rarely discussed or brought into class, unless it is published probably in top journals. Generally here in the UK, economic degrees have compulsory macro, micro, and stats and econometrics, and a possibility, a wide range of, of optional modules. There are, lots more than I got the choice of in Argentina. There tends to be no compulsory economic history or history economic thought courses, however. So those are in a massive kind of synthesized way, my experiences, albeit as a different person, one mainly as a student and the other one's mainly as a lecturer. But I see commonalities and differences between these two experiences that, for me, impact on what it has to be understood as decolonizing economics. One is theory and methodology, and this feeds a lot into what Grieve just said. What gets taught in universities, hence the main takeaways economic students get from higher education, are mainly mainstream economic models. That's not news, right? However, my experience as an economics student in Argentina and my knowledge from other Latin American countries is that Latin American economics education is slightly more pluralistic than in the global north. Slightly. We know that the mainstream models are mainly developed in the global north and are developed to examine countries in the global north, but are applied in many cases to the global south. One really recent-ish historical experience being the liberalization of the 1990s. But the global south starting premises are extremely different. High inequality, high informality, to name some characteristics, right? So I think that to design policy, we need more models that account for these particularities. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that it's not important to understand mainstream macroeconomics. I think it is, but I think it's also important, equally important, to open the door to other models and theories and methodologies. Knowledge of these other modules, vertical methods, right, is particularly important when trying to prescribe policy for global south countries. A second very important point behind decolonizing economics, I think, is that of language. There's a huge language barrier regarding the economic content that travels around the world. This feeds into the theory and methodology point that I've highlighted before, but it's also very important to highlight here that global south knowledge barely reaches the global north and barely travels within the global south as well. A global south scholar needs to publish in English and in top journals, all based in the global north, for there to be the fusion of his or her ideas. Another point that I find particularly relevant concerning the colonizing economics has to do with economic history and history of economic thought. Undergraduate programs need to have modules, ideally compulsory, on these disciplines. Where I am at the University of Warwick, there's compulsory economic history for first-year students, but that's not the norm. As I mentioned, in Argentina, that is the norm. Sometimes, and if I remember correctly, we had more than one economic history module that was compulsory, and we had one compulsory history of economic thought. This is important because knowledge is not elaborated in a vacuum. We need to know where ideas come from. We need to know how historians explain how the economy has changed over time and how different countries develop over time. Understanding context is also needed for understanding economic ideas. And the last point that I want to make concerning decolonizing economics from my personal experience relates to women in economics. Many years have passed since I was an undergraduate student and was mainly taught by male lecturers. It seems that more women study economics, yes, and more women become academics. So you tend to have a greater number of women lecturers, for example. However, and I'm quoting here a tweet from Erin Hengel that I saw yesterday or the day before. The latest issue of Econometrica, which has a total of 36 different authors, not 36 papers, but 36 authors. 97% of those authors are male. Okay, so 35 out of those 36 authors. So it would seem that things are better for women, but I think we're far from there yet. So why have I talked to you about my experiences in the global south and the global north? Because I think decolonizing is not something that needs to happen in a particular part of the world. It needs to happen to economics more broadly. Collectives of researchers and spaces like Rethinking Economics try to do this by giving voice to researchers from different parts of the world, by bringing to the table discussions of what's happening elsewhere, and by questioning mainstream economics. But what more can be done? And here are some ideas. First, I think that we need to embrace the fact that economics is a social science, like sociology and like political science. All these disciplines try to explain society, albeit from different viewpoints. And although we might have to study them separately in a formal setting, there are not silos that shouldn't be integrated. I strongly believe that you can't do economic analysis without thinking about the political environment economic policy decisions might be taken in, nor without considering the characteristics of the society that economic policy might be trying to benefit. Aspects related to politics, society's characteristics, and history might be very difficult to add to econometric models. Equally, models, as we know, are abstractions from reality and will never portray all those aspects fully. So what I think it's really important is that we need to know, right, the assumptions of our models. We need to know that, what we're applying and when, to be sure that we are also conscious of what we are trying to analyze and what we can analyze and what we cannot analyze. Second, I think it's really important that we question what we read and what we're taught, and that we don't take anything at face value. Third, there's something really important that I think we do not need to take at face value, and that's statistics. Why? Because statistics are not a simple realistic measurement operation. They're not a simple reflection of reality. They influence in the constitution of our shared reality. So they reflect reality, but at the same time, they construct and develop reality. To elaborate statistics, definitions are needed a priori to determine the phenomenon to be measured and the aim of the quantification. Statistics are produced by humans who make judgments based on their own ideas and aims. All statistics face debates about methods, interpretation, and use. Even though statistics can be perceived as facts detached from producers and users that are unproblematic and certain, quantification and its results are not objective. Along these lines, as many of you, as you know, there's much debate going around regarding GDP measurements, partly because GDP, as we understand it, is a statistic conceived at a time when industrial development was considered a crucial path to economic development more broadly. And that didn't account for example, the depletion of the environment or the work done within the household that's unpaid for. Fourth, if you're studying, choose elective modules or courses that are different from what you study in your core modules, or that expand on particular aspects that your core modules barely mention. Environmental economics, economic history, feminist economic, behavioral economics, history of economic thought. Fifth, get together in reading groups where you focus on a particular topic or area and read and discuss content that you find interesting and is not necessarily taught in your modules or courses. I learned a lot doing that in my undergrad, and it opened up a world of knowledge that otherwise I don't, it would have taken me much longer to come across. Sixth, and I'm almost done, if you're organizing events, give more voice to research of the Global South, and this is what what Rethinking is doing. Translate the research if you can as well. If you're a lecturer, mention the research in your lectures, and in a very, along the lines of what Grieve described, do collaborative research with people on the, the Global South and the Global North together, but not in the way that he described, as equals. Invite, have these groups invite people to seminars and take the opportunity, that we're in with everything online, trying to bridge the distance in that case. And last but not least, I think for everyone, and this is obviously what I do, I guess, do research on the Global South, and in that process, engage with local researchers and their research. That's a way from both sides, I guess, to get research channeled and moving throughout the world in a very equal way. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much for that input, Cecilia. I think that some of your experiences with regard to teaching, with regard to learning, are very applicable to a lot of us not interacting with any research from the Global South or any learning from the Global South until we're in postgrad. I think resonated with me from that discussion. Can I just say to all of the audience, please remember to put your questions in the Q&A tab. And also, please do like the questions that you think are most similar to your questions, just so we don't have a duplication, and also so we know which questions to pose to the panelists. Great, can we please have our next speaker? Jayati, please, can you go ahead?
Thank you so much, Chego, and what a terrific panel. I'm absolutely delighted. I think all these absolutely critical and important points have been put together so beautifully that I really don't have much to say. So thank you both. That was absolutely terrific. And I couldn't agree with you more. Everything you said had such resonance, certainly in India, but across developing Asia, and I'm sure also Cecilia suggested similarly in Latin America. Possibly Latin America a bit less than in our countries, but clearly there is, I think both the previous speakers have highlighted two very, very important aspects of the colonization in the discipline that are slightly different and that we need to be mindful of. I think Grieve put it perfectly and brilliantly in terms of the straightforward colonization, if you like, of how the developing world is seen as the field for the North, which is the source of knowledge and theory and analysis. And we are the coolies, if you like, of the project of understanding and then suggesting policies and so on. And Cecilia highlighted the fact that, you know, the discipline itself has been colonized by orthodoxy and by a particular notion, which is of even the research questions and the concerns and the frameworks, which are deeply limiting. So with that, with those two very brilliant interventions, I'm going to just begin by adding a couple of footnotes, I think, to what has already been said, and then talk a little bit more also about how we can try and change this and what we can do about it. So I think, you know, one of the features that Grieve mentioned is about how the source of knowledge, the source of intellectual creativity is the North, and that is then transmitted to the South. And of course, one of the ways in which this expresses itself most of all, especially in development, which is still seen as something that is happening in the developing world rather than happening everywhere, is through these fads that emerge in what I would now call the global development industry, because it's a combination of theoretical arguments, empirical and applied economics kinds of research, and then policy around it. And these fads, now we've seen, I mean, certainly in the last 3 decades, we've seen 3 very clear fads, okay? There was the whole microfinance fad, when that was the magic bullet that would actually solve everything. And so it was not just that that was a policy fad, that determined the research, that determined the, a lot of the teaching then derived from that. And it was a fad driven by being picked up in the North and then distributed across the developing world. So all of us were suddenly researching microfinance and of course doing microfinance, encouraging it in policy terms and so on. Then the next one was cash transfer. And again, you know, basically it could be an experiment in a developing country, but it has to be picked up in the North. And then given this magic status of the solution, the development panacea, and then everybody's rushing around doing cash transfers because that's all the flavor of the month. And you know, you're all researching it, encouraging it, checking out which way it works and so on. Of course, the current one is RCTs, which is more a methodological fad than a specific policy fad. But it is, I think Grieve kind of mentioned it, in a way it's actually more worrying because it's methodologically, I mean, there are many issues to be concerned with. There are the ethical issues, there are various other issues. But I think one of the bigger problems with the whole RCT revolution, India and Kenya are, of course, the homes of this RCT revolution, but I think it's spreading dramatically across large parts of the developing world. One of the big problems with it is, in fact, the progressive miniaturization of issues. So what you do is you get more and more and more micro into trying to understand anything. And then, of course, the more micro you get, then poverty becomes a reflection of what you are doing. Just like, as Grieve so brilliantly put it, Africa is responsible for its own shit, if you like. You know, Africa is in a mess because Africans have made it a mess. Similarly, if you're poor, it's because, you know, you haven't been doing the right things. You haven't made the right decisions. And so you have to be nudged in different ways. And so here's an experiment to suggest how you could be nudged to do the right thing that would get you out of poverty, or, you know, make you be, like, give your children better food, or make sure they're immunized, or whatever. Now, what that does is actually reduce the scope of thinking about development, which is fundamentally not about the specific individual choices. It is really about processes. And so what it has done is actually impoverished the discipline. So it's a deeper problem than just being a regular development fad. And by making it what is called the gold standard of all development, now everything has to pass the test of, you know, can you establish it through an RCT? What you're really doing is directing everybody's intellects and energies and time and resources into these activities, which progressively reduce the scope of understanding, which progressively move you away from looking at processes, which move you away from looking at the possibility that some people are poor because others are rich. I mean, something that we knew 150 years ago, but it's no longer on the table as a way to analyze an economy or a society or a global economy. So I think the facts, the brilliant kind of analysis that we made of that old style colonization, that also has a reflection in this fact of constantly, of being shifted in terms of the way we think. And that, again, then resonates with the very important point Cecilia made about the colonizing within economics. And there are two kinds of colonizing here. I think she mentioned several, actually. There's also a very rich and profound kind of thing. But there are two kinds of colonizing that I want to pick up on. One is, of course, the colonizing of orthodoxy, of the neoclassical orthodoxy that doesn't go away. No matter what happens, it doesn't go away. Okay, and that's, of course, a reflection of the power structures which want it to actually exercise the kind of dominance and sway and so on. And that orthodoxy is reproduced in many ways, in the global north as well as in the global south. It's reproduced in terms of whether you can publish in the so-called top journals, and the top journals, again, are defined by the papacy, by the authorities out there. And then, of course, then your jobs depend on whether you've published in those A or B or C journals and how many you have in each of those. And so then once you're in there, your ability to get research grants depends on whether you're doing the kinds of things which will then get published in those journals. And so you are also necessarily encouraged to teach in the ways that would enable your students to also follow that same trajectory. So there is a strong power structure, and we know that this is extensively the case in the United States, in England, everywhere. But it's also the case in the developing world. It's very, very difficult, even in the developing world, for the universities, and by the way, now many private universities coming up, also privileging a foreign international degree over a national degree, privileging somebody publishing in an international journal as opposed to a national or local journal, all of that. Okay, so that particular colonization by the orthodoxy is something that all of us know, and that's why we have to keep saying heterodox, which is already marginalizing. Heterodox means you're not mainstream, means you're on the side, and you have to find your space on the side. And my aim, my goal would be to have them on the margins. Actually, they are marginalists, right? Let them be on the margins for a change in terms of understanding the economy and the society. But there's another aspect of the colonization of the discipline, which has to do with the fact that economics itself is such a silo. And it's always had a rather imperialist attitude, not just to other disciplines, to other study, I would call it other sources of study, but also other aspects of material reality, which is why it's taken so long, for example, for nature to get a look in. Okay, and basically it used to be that environmental economists do that, and they're a little subsect of their own, and occasionally you can talk to them, but a normal economist, a development economist, doesn't have to keep factoring that into everything that we do. Climate change, okay, you talk about it, and maybe now there's funding for it, so you do a little bit of research on that as well, but it doesn't get integrated into how you look at that subject, how you look at the processes. So I think what has happened as part of these colonizations, these three separate colonizations, is that there are two critical things that have hugely impoverished economics. One is, as I said, this move towards the micro rather than looking at macro processes, looking at big things, which is what really the original worldly philosophers did. And the second is the move to the short term, rather than looking at change over time, looking at evolution, looking at how these things, the trajectories of particular things. And of course, if you looked at trajectory, for example, you would then start looking at whether African development is, because they're all so incompetent, why in India we cannot get it together because of X or Y, or there are longer historical processes that we have to understand if we really want to understand that process of development. So, I mean, you know, I'm just repeating really what they've already said, but I think it was so brilliantly and fantastically put that it's worth just picking up some of those points. Now, having said that, and I don't have too much time, I just want to say, what do we do about it? Fine, it's all terrible, there's a disaster, these are enormous power structures. It's very hard to know what's going on. How do we confront it? We are just small cogs in this enormous machine. So here's what I think is what's so hopeful about some of the changes that have happened in the last few decades. It's difficult, right, to find hopeful things. So it's nice to know that there is something. One of the big problems that has always been the case, and what the reason why we 20 years ago nearly founded this thing called International Development Economics Associates as a South-based network of development economists, because we felt that all our knowledge and all our understanding is mediated by the global north, and in fact by the North Atlantic, by the US and the UK. So, you know, we don't even know each other's work. We don't know that there is fantastic and very illuminating stuff coming out of Brazil, and that there's really interesting economists working in Argentina or Chile, or that in the Philippines or in Malaysia or somewhere else, or in Africa. We don't know each other's work. We only find out if we happen to go to the same Northern conferences or we publish in the Northern journals. We don't exchange among ourselves. So the purpose of IDEAS was actually to do that, to actually enable us to know each other's work. Because it's not true that there isn't a lot of fantastic work out there. There is. There's a lot of, I mean, amazing work and amazing analysis that is happening. But it's not taken seriously as analysis because the gatekeepers in the North don't let you in. And so we wanted to actually establish a network that would generate much more knowledge of each other's work and disseminate that. Now, in fact, it did reasonably well, I think, for a while, but it just doesn't get funding. And here's one of the things I think which is really sad, is that again you have to rely on northern institutions for even funding for these kinds of South collaborations. We need to be able to engage people in the South more to generate the kinds of resources that would enable this knowledge about each other. I think that's one of the critical things that we have to do. But it's much, much easier now. We can have this discussion. There can be, 225 people from across the world actually accessing each other's ideas and being able to exchange. That's something which we couldn't do 20 years ago. And I think we have to build on that. Really have to use that opportunity which is available. The second thing that we have to do, and I think Cecilia already mentioned that, is really consciously move towards looking for the stuff that is out there. There was a brilliant piece study that came out in the Brazilian Journal of Political Economy by someone, and I wrote to the author asking, can we put it up on our Network Ideas website, the website of the organization that I run, which has a reasonable kind of international readership. And he said, please do, because since it came out in that journal, nobody outside Brazil will ever see it. That should not be happening. It's not only language, by the way. That particular article was in English and in Portuguese. So we don't look. We are not encouraged to look. Whether I'm sitting in New Delhi or I'm sitting in London or I'm sitting in New York or California, or I'm sitting in Egypt, I'm not going to be looking for those. I'm going to be looking at the mainstream journals. That's a conscious decision we can make to actually go out there and look more. And again, technology, social media, all of this allows us to do this in ways that we didn't have before. And I think we have to really maximize on that as much as possible. Third thing I think we have to do, and this is something that people in the North can do as well. We have to be much more mindful of these alternative traditions, of these alternative approaches, and of these alternative locations, and of alternative types of people who are writing, not just the dead white men or the living white men. Okay, and that mindfulness is something that is often quite difficult because, as I mentioned, of the power imbalances. Okay, let me give you two personal examples. I have a lot of research students who naturally, because everybody wants to see the world, at some point also want to go out and see the world and want to apply abroad. So when they write their theses, and they've written pretty good theses, you suddenly find that in the references, there's nobody from India, including all the people whose ideas are very much in that dissertation, that you know are in that dissertation, but they are not mentioned in the list. Who's mentioned in the list? All the Northern scholars of development, of course, but all the Northern scholars are all mentioned. Why? Because really you need to make it in that world, and so the incentives are skewed against too much publicity to the the locals, if you like. This is tough, I know, and I'm not asking individuals to change it, but let's be mindful. If everybody is mindful, it actually changes in a slightly different way, and that's as true of the North as it is of the South. I have seen too many departments in the North, including run by progressives, I have to say this, including heterodox, where the dominant bibliography, if you like, is Northern. And this is when they are studying development. The dominant approaches, analysis, perspective, theoretical frameworks, references are Northern. And they haven't made sufficient effort, I believe, to go out there and see what there is. Some of it is translation. I think Cecilia is absolutely right, especially for Latin America. But it's not only that, it's much more than that, because there's a lot of work coming out of Asia in English, which is still not given that same kind of importance. Second and last point I just want to make in this example I want to give, a few years ago, Eric Reinert, Rainer Katchel, and we brought out a volume. It's called the Elgar Handbook of Alternative Theories of Development. And one of the things we were very conscious of was to actually be looking actively for people who had been writing about development over history and currently in ways that had not been picked up. And we were astonished at the variety and the fantastic nature of different, Chinese theories of development, Ottoman theories of industrialization, etc., which I had no knowledge of before we went to actively explored and tried to find these. They are out there. We are not encouraged to go and look at it. We are not often able to look at it, but now it's much more possible than it ever was. So I think a lot of the problems that we faced earlier, they still exist. The power imbalances are huge, the money, the resources, all of that stuff is very much there. The orientation of our governments and the orientation of our elites, which are all still very Northern focused, all that is still there. But some of the new changes in information technology have allowed us much greater access, much greater ability to actually find out about each other, to celebrate each other's work, to learn from each other, and to feel a bit more confidence, therefore, as a result, in terms of the intellectual value of the economics that is produced in the developing South and the economics that is produced by the non-orthodoxy. Okay, let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I think what I found very interesting from your discussion is how it's been generational, this quest to decolonizing. Economics is generational. You have been part of the ideas organization, and we're trying to start organizations like Rethinking Economics for Africa to try to address the same issues. So I found that interesting. And I also thought that what you said about being diverted away from processes and thinking because of like funding from the global north and being sort of dictated to with regard to policy. I found that very interesting and found that it tied very closely to what Grieve said about funding forcing us to internalize our issues, even though we know that that's not necessarily true. And this concept of extroversion, which I found very, very important to be able to publish and to have access to the greater conversation. And just, I think, just on that topic, having gone through some of the questions, I think that an initial question that I would pose just for response amongst the speakers before we open it up again is how do we navigate the situation of resources? Because the global north has the kind of resources to be able to dictate our policy or the kind of research that we do, as per what Grieve said. And also, as what Cecilia said, are funding the pedagogy in general, right? So the kind of textbooks that we use and the kind of thinking that should go forward. How do we navigate around the situation of resources, considering the global south doesn't have endowments that are that like large to make our own south-centered research happen? Yeah, I think that's a question that I would put forward, having drawn on some, like the feel of the first few questions that have come through the Q&A. So that question is for all panelists or anyone who has something to say, feels strongly, most strongly about answering that question.
I'm going to request Grieve to go first, if possible.
Okay, all right. Thanks, Prof. Ghosh. I will, you know, when a professor summons you, you have to respond. That's a good question. So how are we to mobilize resources is, I think, what the question is. This certainly is true, especially speaking from the African point of view, that, you know, with the collapse of universities, that came in the 80s and 90s, again, off the back of misguided policy advice. You know, the World Bank told African governments that universities, they did some complex, sophisticated, you know, regressions, you know, statistical analysis that said that universities in Africa, the returns to social returns to university education in Africa to higher education are much lower than the social returns to primary education. So you African governments rather spend on primary education and leave the market to sort out higher education. Surprise, surprise, not even northern universities. Northern universities are, you know, sort of feed at the teat of public funding. So surprise, surprise, African universities collapsed, research funding also collapsed, and that kind of stuff. So it's really a difficult one. I think on the one hand, we have to try to get our own governments to start funding research. Fortunately, the South African government, where I am here, where I work at the University of Cape Town and sort of the South African Academy, the South African government does do that rather well. It's not done so well in the rest of the African continent, but it's also important to understand that part of the problem has got to do with the fact that foreign money crowds out, to use an economic term, crowds out domestic money. I mean, so African governments are thinking, look, all these donors are pumping money into research. Why should we do it? After all, they're doing it. After all, you know, what they're finding out from these research enterprises is helping out policy work. You know, our policy elites, like Professor Ghosh has just said, they're not very creative sometimes. So I think there's all these things to think about. There's also the aspect that if we're willing to decolonize, we have to then engage with some of these funding organizations and say to them, look, if you really do care, it seems like you do care when I read your policy documents. I don't know if you really care in effect, but you really do care as put down in your policy documents. I think you have to structure these funding arrangements differently. Rather give Southern voices much more room to maneuver in these grants, rather emphasize that the PIs, you know, should be based in the South. If it's a Southern project that has, you know, huge ramifications, either ethically, methodologically, community-wise. It might disrupt communities, for example. I think we need to do all these kinds of things to reach out and to some of these funding agencies and really have them structure some of these funding arrangements differently. But it's a really good question, and I'm curious to hear what my other co-panelists have to say. Yeah.
I guess that if we're continuing in order, it's my turn. I agree with Grieve in terms of trying to, I don't know how, but yeah, try to have governments fund more research is definitely one option. I do also agree that, you know, trying to negotiate the terms of agreement with financial institutions or funding bodies from the global north is another option. And I guess that maybe I'm thinking more naively. It's, you know, and I sort of said it before, it's the pairing up with people, you know, global South and global North researchers, through, you know, there's these, I think we're at a time where a lot of stuff can be done online, and in a way, to some extent, the internet democratizes knowledge. That may be controversial, but I'm trying to look at the positive side of that, and makes contact between different, now being in touch with people from different parts of the world much easier. So it makes collaboration much easier. So I guess one way of, you know, dealing with the resources that tries to move away from governments and tries to move away from the big bodies of funding, the big funding bodies and the big funding agencies, is to try to pair up with researchers, you know, from the global South and the global North. And something that was mentioned as well before in terms of like textbooks as well, something that I thought is the fact that, you know, if to try to decolonize the textbooks that then get used in the global South, is try to negotiate ways to incorporate local content, local thinkers, global South thinkers and content to these big textbooks that basically everyone uses to learn macro and micro and like those seem to me as important as government and you know, dealing with government and dealing with financial or research agencies, but in a way perhaps, yeah, the others, I don't know, I don't trust the Argentine government to fund research in, you know, massive quantities anytime soon. So I think the other option is a bit more likely, and that's what I try to do with myself, with my colleagues back home, because Argentina is still my object of study in a way, and I feel that I can't do it alone from the UK at the moment, right? So it's still engaging with people in whichever way you can. That's my take.
Okay, I want to bring in just a slightly different point on this. I agree with what both have just said. Wait a minute, sorry, I moved the camera. Okay, I want, you know, what we forget is that actually a lot of this research that the Global North does on the South is actually funded by the South. What do I mean? Around 70% of the aid that many countries give, the UK for sure, actually goes to northern institutions. And of course they vary. It used to be the IDS and, you know, Oxford International Development and so on, and now it's maybe Adam Smith Institute and others. But they are the beneficiaries of what is called aid. And a lot of that aid, mind you, is not pure grant, it's also loan. Developing countries are paying for that research. So let's not kid ourselves, okay? RCTs, classic example. That Jameel, I'm sorry to put it openly and blatantly like this, but Jameel Poverty Action Lab would die tomorrow if Indian and Kenyan money was removed. Indian state governments and Indian and Kenyan government, they are paying for this research. So it's not really true that, you know, we don't have the money. Unfortunately, the political economy of the way all of this is structured is that governments of the global South, either in terms of allowing that aid money to go, or in terms of their own money that they spend, hard-earned citizens' tax revenues that they spend for research, are too oriented towards these fads globally, and therefore they end up funding that. So I think there is that element as well. There is a politics to this lack of funding that occurs. And so once we know about it, it's possibly easier to address it. The second thing I want to say is that, you know, when we say that they have all the money and we don't have enough money, why is it so expensive? Because it's all based on northern salaries. Whereas, you know, if you did this thing, I mean, people are shocked that we have been running ideas for, as I said, nearly 2 decades on what would be the salary of one professor in a northern institution. And we have organized conferences, we have, because it's all happening in the developing South. It's actually even easier now because what we're doing right now doesn't even cost very much. It costs hardly anything. to do this kind of webinar. Of course, it's not like the real thing. It's not like meeting face to face and getting the joy of interaction over a series of days and having many conversations throughout the course of a day and evening and so on. It's not the same, sure, but we can have it and it's much cheaper. I'm saying that a lot of the costs of research are very high because of the fact that they are budgeted in very northern terms. So once we remove that and we recognize that, you know, we will actually be able to do research much more cheaply, but effectively, and collaborate with each other, we won't have that sort of, you know, inevitable dependence on, you know, the money from the north. And the trouble is that really, you know, the incentives are so skewed. And I cannot blame young people, you know, I can't, because where are the jobs? Where is the research money? And suddenly there are these jobs there. If you want to do an RCT, you get research money. If you want to, you know, work with somebody who's doing an RCT, you'll get a job. I can't blame people. The incentives are so badly skewed. Now that's a deeper and more significant problem in the entire discipline. Of course, if you do heterodox, then the incentives are skewed against you even in the north. So that's another concern and issue. But you know, one of the things that has happened, I think, is that this complete failure of the mainstream to actually explain the real world in any significant way. It's true that they're in with the existing power structures and so on, but you know, those existing power structures at some point have to be able to keep the whole thing going, right? At the moment, they're not able to. It's very clear. I mean, I think Wolfgang Stake, a lot of people don't like him for other reasons, what he did to the trade union movement in Germany and so on. But he has this wonderful book about how capitalism dies. And he basically says, listen, it's already dead. It is no longer able to do what capitalism is supposed to do in terms of, you know, minimum dynamism and so on. Of course, it's exploitative, etc., but it's supposed to deliver this material dynamism. It's no longer able to do so because it's been too successful for its own good in terms of demolishing anything that could stop its power, untrammeled power. But it's dead. The problem is there's nobody to push the dead body out of the way. So we've got this kind of shroud hanging all over us. If you recognize that, then you can actually think of ways to actually push, you know, for different new changes. And I think we are being, I think, you know, for example, Rethinking Economics, I think it's terrific. And I see so many things like this sprouting, you know, Decolonizing Economics is another group. And there's so many wonderful groups and networks coming out that, you know, when we started Ideas, we were this fringe little group trying to kind of establish South-South interaction with like-minded people in the North. It's not that, you know, we're going to say, no, we won't touch you if you're in the North. And now I see it's happening organically. I think all of you young people are doing this and you're so good at finding each other. And, you know, I mean, the internet has done many terrible things, but it's done this great thing, which is it's enabling us to find each other. So I think we can't see the earlier constraints as binding as they were. I think they have changed. And I think the way in which we do economics, ultimately, if it is actually relevant and insightful, it will have a resonance. You can't get rid of it. You can't dump it completely. And that resonance will feed eventually also later into academia.
Great, thank you for those responses. I think I will pose a question to each panelist, and then it looks like we'll only have time for 1 or 2 questions each, and then we'll need closing statements, and then we can finish, well, the discussion will come to an end. So one question that has been posed has been about, and I think Cecilia, could you take this on, about how science and mathematics has been prioritized in economics. And you spoke a bit about how humanity and like human beings have been removed from it. So how do we challenge this perception of economics, like it's rooting now in mathematics and this prioritization of maths over like the more social aspects of economics. And I think to Grieve, a question was, it might, I'm not sure if it would be repetitive, but I think do see what you would like to answer in the question. But it's that the ideal is that decolonization would be a rejection of the dominant discourse of the West and like the global South taking control of their own stories. So why has this not happened, especially because we're in this so-called post-colonial moment? And how does the comprador elite perpetuate itself in the role of power the roles of power that uphold this outdated and irrelevant economic and political structures? Yeah, and I think that might speak to resources, but do you have a different perspective? And to Prof, I saw very specific to, I think, the Indian context specifically, it was about caste, and it was about, well, I can't find it anymore, but it was about how we can decast and oh, I forgot the word and I can't find the question, but how do we, it was essentially about intersectionality, because I think that our conversation in terms of decolonization has focused on inequality in terms of resources and race. But I think like there was a bigger like patriarchy of caste, maybe like also the way that colonization has affected the environment, etc. So just opening that up. Yeah. Can you keep the answers brief so we can maybe get one or two more questions before we wrap up?
So am I going to go first, or Cecilia would like to go first because you asked the question in that order?
Yeah, can we get you first and then we can, so just go in the order that we've been going.
Okay, so thanks for that question. I think if I understand it correctly, the question is about, so why has decolonization of economics been a difficult thing? You know, I think that's sort of broadly what the question is about. And it's just worth highlighting here that it's not just economics that is suffering with this idea of, you know, the cognitive empire. So this idea of a colonial terrain. I think it's many disciplines in the social sciences and even the physical sciences are battling with these issues. My sense is that I think economics is far behind. I mean, it is only quite recently, and even that we're having these kinds of debates. And even then, these are happening really, to my mind, they're happening in the margins. In, for example, in area studies, or in African studies, or in, you know, maybe Latin American studies or East Asian studies, you know, they've moved a little bit far along and they're, you know, having much more concrete debates about this. So, I mean, there are very many reasons why economics hasn't been decolonized. And part of it, you alluded to it, is an issue of resources. We've had a discussion about this. But I mean, and also the other issue is just the nature of the discipline itself. As you know, for a big part of its, much of the 20th century, for example, it was thought of as a science, right? And similarly to the physical sciences. I mean, typified, for example, by the Bank of Sweden, even establishing a Nobel Prize in economic sciences, right? So if you are studying science, to be honest, as most people, as a discipline was sought as a science, like a proper science, it doesn't really matter. There are no political issues in science. So at least that's what most people think, you know, it's not political. All you're doing is just describing objects as you would describe stones, flowers, and so on and so forth. And seen this way, you know, politics doesn't matter. It's outside of it because the researchers are doing science, right? I mean, somebody at the World Bank, I remember once said to me that, Grieve, you know, does it really matter, you know, what the geologist, whether it's the geologist is male, female, or white, when they're doing geology? It doesn't really matter because they're going to this person, they're just describing the stones or the Earth's surface. Similarly, economists are engaged in a similar enterprise. So I think it's this idea that economics as a science has in very many ways delayed this process of decolonization. We now know that that's bank. We have always known that that's bank. Economics is very political, right? And then also the role of the elite, the role of people like me, you know, obviously as Professor Ghosh has stated earlier, it's very difficult to get ahead in this discipline. You know, if all you're ever raving about is decolonization, I still need to get promoted. I still need to advance in my career as an economist. I still need recognition, and the structures are such that that recognition comes from the North, right? It comes from me publishing in Northern journals. It comes from me publishing in going to Northern conferences. It comes from me being invited to spend sabbaticals in Northern institutions. So I think pretty much these are all sort of forces that are making it quite difficult for us to decolonize the discipline. That would be my attempt at an answer.
So if I understood correctly, the question for me was something along the lines of, and it's not that different in a way from what Grieve was just talking about, right? So, you know, economics is a science very much identifying with math and has left individuals to the side, or humans to the side. So what can we do about it? And to be honest, I mean, I don't know. It's really hard, and it's something that I ask myself every time that I go and teach certain things. What I can say in terms of, I think it's something that we need to do, or that we can change from practice. And again, this story, this is a bit self referential. I don't know if that's actually a word in English, but what I try to do is just try not to engage in that type of research, and I try to have and persevere and to try to do economic history in a way that is not so quantifiable and so mathematized, because I think me as I don't have the power to change too much, but I can sort of do little bits, and that's my little bit. I don't think it's enough, but if all of, you know, each of us does a little bit, that sums to a greater much, if that makes sense. So, you know, try from our own practice, try to engage in other, you know, readings, try to incorporate, you know, politics and sociology and anthropology and all of that to our way of kind of analyzing the economy.
Okay, you know, thank you for that question. That is such an important question, and I'm sorry I didn't actually talk about caste or patriarchy really, but because this is an international thing, and you know, caste is such an Indian thing. We are unique in the most complex system of hierarchy, discrimination, and exclusion that exists in the world. We really have tops in that in India. Now, what that means then is that all of these things, these imbalances of power that I've been talking about, the global, the regional, the local, the funding, etc., all of these are amplified and made much worse by particularly these phenomena of caste and patriarchy. And I would say in India, actually, caste trumps patriarchy in academia, at least. You know, I mean, an upper caste woman like myself will have much fewer problems than a lower caste man. And it's something that is so deep and yet so apparently invisible that it takes a lot to get around it. So, you know, how does one address that? To be honest, you know, I am a great believer in reservation and quota systems, because I have found in my own university in JNU that you need sufficient numbers even to make the few who are in there feel more comfortable. I remember when we didn't have what is called OBC, other backward class reservation. So we had reservation and we used to fill the quotas, but that came to about a quarter of the class. And so the people who came under those reserved quotas were more shy, more quiet, more unwilling to come out with a lot of the problems. And it wasn't only the language barrier. There was a language barrier, but it wasn't only that. It was just the broader, I think that, this lack of a sense of comfort and confidence. When you got that OBC reservation, suddenly the reserved category was more than half the class. The dynamic changed. And as a result of the fact that there were so many more, then even the ones who had been quieter earlier were more able to come out and talk or ask questions or participate more. Or there was just a greater level of comfort and confidence. I really do believe that you have to have sufficient numbers. Now, that's the trouble is that it's not just enough in the classroom situation, right? There are many power dynamics at play. Who gets research funding, who gets access to professors that they can talk in the same comfortable way and then get the better reference to go and travel abroad, or, all of those things, they're all there. All I can say is that, this is a continuous struggle. The same thing also with patriarchy, right? These are not struggles that we can say we've solved the problem and we've dealt with it. We haven't. We're always struggling. All of us are dealing with this in our own ways. Sometimes we're more successful, sometimes we're less successful. The same people in dealing with this. But I think being conscious of it is a very, very important step forward. And that consciousness comes when there are enough people out there to make you aware of that it is a problem. Things that you would not see otherwise because you come from a particularly privileged perspective. Someone has to make you see it. So I think that's why all of this is also very important, these kinds of discussions. Unfortunately, I mean, it's good that we can have a discussion like this online because otherwise we would never meet. But I can tell you that having online classes has been absolutely disastrous from that diversity standpoint. Because I have a compulsory class of 92 and not more than 30 have been able to attend those online lectures because of connectivity, different material circumstances, very different situations in their homes where they cannot have the freedom and the resources to access online. So it's a double-edged thing, this thing. Okay.
Great, thank you for that, everyone. It's 5:30, and that's how long we were supposed to run to. So, well, in South Africa. So we've had our hour and a half. So unfortunately, I'm going to have to ask everyone to give some closing statements. We received a lot of questions, so unfortunately, we weren't able to get to all of them. But I think that the conversation will continue in the festival. I know that tomorrow and Sunday, the conversation continues. But also there's opportunity to reach out to all of the panelists individually on their respective social media platforms and also to engage with their work. So can I please get some closing statements from all of the speakers and then we'll wrap up the discussion. Yeah, starting with Grieve.
Sorry, before you go, Grieve, at the end as well, we'll also just have an advert for the other sessions in the stream, so don't leave immediately.
So please could everyone stay online for like a minute after.
Yes, thanks, Grieve.
Okay, thank you so much for this opportunity, to fellowship with everybody else and with the many participants who joined in from across the world. I learned a lot from this session, lots to think about. And just to say very quickly that this is a very useful conversation that we've started. The economics profession really needs it, and it will go a long way in helping a lot of many people across the world. So it's really important that we had this discussion. And I just encourage folks who are out there to, to relearn, unlearn to relearn. I myself a couple of years ago was completely obsessed with the Northern paradigm of economics, but I had to sort of unlearn and reteach myself and seek out other types of alternative voices by doing exactly what Professor Ghosh says. There's many publications out there that are based in the Global South. There are many sort of research centers in the Global South that are doing some very, very important kind of work. So I encourage people to go read those pieces of work and to unlearn, unlearn to relearn. That's what I would say. And people should feel free to reach out to me if they want me to send them texts to read and those kinds of things. So thanks again for this opportunity. I really, really appreciate it. And I had so much fun and I learned a lot from it. Thank you.
So I want to echo absolutely everything that Grieve said. This has been really interesting way to think and rethink, stuff that's always been in the back of my head. Yeah, and it's great to know that there are, at some point 200 and something people willing to listen about decolonizing economics. I think that's, a great message for the powers that be. And I guess that my closing, I guess I have two things that I will take away with me. First is, be engaged and keep being engaged with people, like-minded people. Try to find them, try to get in touch with them. I agree with Grieve. I'm happy to be in touch and send material and discuss things with anyone. Try to find each other as well. That's the only way that, that we can kind of move forward. And this is a conversation, and that's really important that that the South, the global South, has with the global North, but that the global South has within itself. So I think it is really important that we all know we're out there and in touch, basically. So thank you so much.
Hi, yes, I just want to say thank you. This has made me feel so optimistic. I mean, first of all, Grieve and Cecilia, you were terrific. You're really good. And then there have been so many interesting questions and comments in the chat that I've just had a quick glance through, but I have not been able to fully absorb. But it just gives me so much hope that there are so many out there, I think dominantly young people. I mean, thank God for this. It just gives me a huge amount of hope, because we are leaving you such a disastrous situation globally and nationally. But when I see that there are so many thoughtful people who are out there willing to engage and so on, I think you guys can handle it. So I'm really grateful that you organized this. Bandile said something I noticed in the comment about comprador elites. Oh boy, do we have those, yes, and we are dealing with them all the time, authoritarian comprador elites. But in our case at least. But if there is enough of this kind of sharing and giving each other inspiration and knowledge and analysis, I think there's a lot of tremendous hope. So thank you. I'm really actually quite energized by this.
Awesome. Thank you to all of the panelists for the work that you do and for availing yourself to share your wisdom with us. It's really appreciated from all of the organizers at RE and all of the different Rethinking Economics chapters across the world. And I also think that what we got from the discussion is to mobilize and to source each other in the global South. To just continue working together and put it in a more organized and structured way. So I would highly suggest anyone who's on a university campus to see how you can start your own Rethinking Economics, or try to link up your economics networks to other economic networks in the global South. So we have one advert that Bandile is going to put up on the screen about a roundtable on decolonization and economics, which will be taking place, not sure of the date and time, but it is in the program. So we'd really appreciate it if you looked out for that and you joined us. Okay, so it's on the screen, and that is going to be on Saturday, the 25th of July in session 1A, and on Sunday, the 26th of July, we're going to be discussing opportunities and challenges faced by economists from the global South. So the discussion will continue, and we would really appreciate it if you joined. And I think in one of the roundtables, people will be able to comment via video. So it'll be really good to hear some voices as well. So thank you for joining us today, and we hope that you have a good weekend ahead at the festival.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much. It was great to be part of this.
Awesome.
Just 30 more seconds for people to scroll through the chat, pick up any links that they missed out, and then we'll close the meeting. All right, thank you.